From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello again. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis. Unfortunately, we've had to cancel our regular show today because we're on storm watch. Because, you know, we're just, are we going to make it home tonight? Will we make it home alive? That's the question we all have to ask. We have Thom Clark at the anchor desk today as we go into storm watch mode. Kimbriell Kelly will be broadcasting live from an overpass over the Kennedy Expressway somewhere. And right now, Whet Moser is with us. Whet, what's the latest from the radar that you're seeing?
Well, we on the way out this morning, they had TV cameras broadcasting live from the giant salt pit near my apartment.
So really? Okay, well, that's
exciting.
A good one. That's good. TV loves a snow story, and we might finally have one, ladies and gentlemen. So while as the snow falls, we will talk about a few other things. But we have some media folks with us today. We want to talk about media and really kind of the way media intersects with the public, particularly in protests, the sit down and shut up laws that have just been put into place or will be soon, and all that kind of stuff. I've already mentioned all our guests, but let's go around the table one more time. Thom Clark is here from the Community Media Workshop, old friend of ours, friend of the show. Glad to have you back again, Thom.
Good to be here again.
Kimbriell Kelly is the Chicago Reporter. She's the interim publisher and editor and a writer. And by the way, if I don't get to this later on, you gotta check out the Barbershop Show. It's a very wonderful podcast that these guys do, and they got to even crow a little bit on the Barbershop Show because Lisa Madigan showed up the other day to I don't know, did you get a haircut while she was there?
She did not get a haircut, but she talked to a lot of folks there.
But let's be serious. The reason she was there was to talk about the contribution that Chicago Reporter has made to moving a big story forward.
A huge story.
Yeah, I should say it's a huge story. But yeah, it was. Go ahead, brag.
I get to talk about it? Okay, well, I mean, everybody knows right now, at least hopefully, about the $335 million countrywide settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice. So this isn't just a lawsuit against Countrywide. I mean, this is, national. And, it's the largest residential fair lending settlement in the nation. And, Lisa Madigan, essentially, we did reporting back in 2005, and I remember because I was a reporter on that story.
Mm-hmm. It was one of your first stories?
It was actually my first investigation.
My
very first investigation with the Chicago Reporter. Mm-hmm. I was a McCormick Fellow, and, we saw that African Americans who were earning over $100,000 a year were more likely to get a subprime loan twice more likely than somebody who was white earning less than $30,000 a year. Mm-hmm. And I worked with my editor, Alden Lowry, at the time when we put out these reports. We continued to write the stories and showed that Countrywide was doing this, Wells Fargo, and subsequently, obviously that caught the attention of our Attorney General. She filed lawsuits, and history was made.
Well, the reason that I wanted to have you expound on that a little bit, not only just because the reporter deserves the credit for it, is that one of the things we want to talk about today is journalism. Where are we with journalism? And of course, one of the things that triggers this is the Chicago Sun-Times up for sale, and we want to talk about that in great detail on the program today. But one of the questions that the Sun-Times sale really kind of brings to the forefront is that the new owners are saying, we're going to move to Wet, you'll have to help me with this. I think it's vertical portals or horizontal portals. I'm not sure which kind of portals it is.
I think vertical.
Vertical. So, but anyway, we're going to push our content into vertical portals. And old guys like me read that and say, yeah, but is anybody going to be doing journalism? Is there going to be reporting? Because that would be the thing that we would really like to see, is reporters doing reporting. And at the same time that I'm reading this in the Chicago Reporter, and I'm reading stuff that lots of people are doing in, the Chicago News Cooperative, Chicago Magazine. There are all kinds of portals that are creating content these days that I would categorize as journalism. So one of the questions that will be on the table today is, do we even care anymore? Is the Sun-Times, are the Tribune, are they the great entries to our news digest anymore? We don't know that.
A study that the workshop did for the Community Trust now a year and a half ago showed that while we have seen a proliferation in the growth of smaller online news sites and blogs, and there is significant traffic or eyes going to those sites. The Tribune, Chicago Now, which I think is maybe fading a little bit, I don't know, we can talk about that, and the Sun-Times still, 6 of the 8 million eyes looking at local online news sites in May of 2010 were going to those 3 legacy sites. So
Now, of
they
course-
still, and we always knew that the daily newspaper, be it print or online, also tended to govern how TV and radio picked up on the news, unless, of course, there's a snowcopter overhead. But,
We'll be going live to that later.
and I don't know when we do this study again this coming summer that we're going to find that that proportion has changed that much, other than I'm expecting, and I don't know how the two of you feel about this, that we'll find there are even more sites out there, as well as discovering sites that have gone away. Because one of the other realities of the online news experience is that things tend to come and go a bit more
it's a
than...
pretty tentative existence if you don't have money and you have 3 or 4 people working practically for nothing, and you can do a couple of years of that, and then at some point somebody gets a job, and that's the end of it. It's one of the kind of sad things about online news, online journalism. Whet, you've written extensively about this, and in fact I want to mention that we're going to put this up on our chicagonewsroom.org site later on today. We had the Chicago Journalism Town Hall about 3 years ago, and afterward you wrote, it was Black, White, and Dead All Over, I believe was the title on it, and it was just one of the best sort of status reports on where online journalism is and what it needs to be. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to just get you back to. It's kind of a ridiculous question, but give us a status update if you can. What do you think is the status of online journalism in Chicago today, and has it changed in a couple of years?
I don't really think it has, actually. I think we mostly have the same the same sites as Thom talked about. The legacy sites are still driving, I think, most of the traffic, and even from my own experiences working at Chicago Magazine, I know that the stuff I write gets a huge boost if it shows up on chicagotribune.com. I think when you're dealing with numbers to that extent, and nationwide and worldwide audiences, it's very, very difficult to drive the bulk of those numbers in one direction very quickly. So I really don't think that there have been a lot of changes since then.
So, well, now that's interesting, because I think 3 years ago we would have thought that if we were sitting down 3 years hence, that it would have been the situation would have been dramatically different. I mean, certainly the Sun-Times has shrunk dramatically. It's just a very tiny little thing now, but it's still there, and it's still doing its legacy thing. And the online world that was promised when we were all sitting around there talking about it has either not happened, or it has happened more slowly, or it's happened in a different kind of way.
I think, and I would just add to that, I mean, a lot hasn't changed in the last few years. A lot of outlets have come and gone. But the good thing is, I think there's a lot more conversation in the background that's happening. And
that's interesting.
And it's happening at the Chicago Reporter, and it's happening at several other different organizations, where it's almost a renaissance, a wake-up call, saying we need to do things differently. And I feel like our industry has changed a lot. And we were looking for what are the best practices. Well, now we have a little bit of an idea of what they are. So now I think you have news organizations like the Chicago Reporter, who's been focusing on the print operation for the last 40 years. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary, taking a look at that a little bit more seriously and looking at the successes and the failures and saying, what can we learn from that? So I feel like even though you haven't seen change in the foreground, in the background, there's still a lot of movement and a lot of learning taking place.
I think the other thing that happened is that your kitchen table blogger found out that after week 13 or week 53, it's hard to keep churning that stuff out, particularly if your online advertising is only producing $13 a month in revenue. Or to put it another way, as daily newspaper publishers always knew, it's expensive to do good journalism. And so that some of the journalism we get now, you could question whether it's good or not. It's filling the paper.
Question whether it's journalism. But.
And I think as they go to the Sun-Times, for instance, tries to go to their vertical, portals or whatever, it's going to be interesting to see the content because there's always Fran Spielman covering City Hall, as her front page story today shows, and a great bank of columnists. But after that, so-called enterprise reporting is kind of slim to none. There are some investigations going on, but nothing like I remember growing up with.
Right.
And even talking with a local funder of some of these efforts locally and nationally, we had a vigorous debate over the difference between investigative reporting, which I divide up into several categories between watchdog journalism, which I think is what's being primarily practiced these days, i.e. which politician has his hand in the wrong cookie jar, versus enterprise reporting, which we could all use a lot more of. The kind that the reporter, I think to a certain extent, our Curtis Black at News Tips has been trying to do all along. Some of Curtis's best stuff this past year looked back at where the foreclosure crisis started, looked at with the new mayor coming in what that meant, with very rich contextual information that quite frankly, we're not seeing as often in the former legacy daily newspapers who you would expect beyond their columnists to try to dig into that kind of reporting.
It's interesting. A few years ago when I became editor of the magazine, I was at a conference and I was talking to Melody Span Cooper, the owner of WVON Radio, and I said, I'm really struggling with this thing. We do this in-depth investigative reporting, these 3,000-word stories that not everybody's going to read 3,000-word stories, especially in this, publishing landscape. Do our reporters write shorter stories? And she told me the best advice. She said, don't change what you do because you're going to see a lot less of it, like Thom mentioned, in the future. What you need to do is focus on repackaging the content that you have. So we have continued to stay focused on our investigative reporting and the transition, what we're moving toward is, okay, well, how can we repackage that in different ways? How can we take advantage of new technology, innovation, changing our website? And those are things that we're going to be, you're going to see a lot of change.
Well, you guys have you have this thing now with Channel 5, right?
We have a brand new partnership with Channel 5. We have some new foundation money coming in to help support some expansion on the digital front. So you'll see a little bit of change this year regarding
I think it's also interesting that we were having a little bit of a conversation before we started about Thom raised a very interesting question for all of us here about, how do you get your news and where do you get your news tips from these days? And one of the things I think we all agreed on is those who push content to you successfully and in an interesting way are succeeding more than those who just kind of throw it up on the wall. And you guys have been certainly doing that. I know my email box almost every day has something about something that you guys are doing. And almost every time it looks intriguing enough to me that I want to click on it. So, and I wouldn't have been there if you hadn't, who was it? Tip O'Neill who said, you got to ask or something, right? If you want my vote, if I want your vote, I have to ask you for it. If you want me to read your stuff, you've got to ask me to read it. And that is what is different in the world today, because it used to be you just put your quarter in the box and pick this up and that was it. But now everything has to be sold to you.
And you have to do everything. It's not just publishing a news magazine. Like you mentioned, we have the Barbershop Show radio, so we're on the radio on Wednesdays and then on Fridays and now also on Saturdays, and you have to be on all the different platforms.
Yeah. Well, the initial reason for asking the three of you here, and we're kind of halfway into it now, was to really talk about this Sun-Times sale. I mean, there are a couple of things that are particularly interesting to me about it. First of all, the fact that it sold for considerably more than any of us would have ever guessed. I mean, over $20 million for this thing. And that means that somebody somewhere believes that the legacy of the Chicago Sun-Times, and this may be people with a lot more money than we have, were sitting around a table somewhere saying exactly what you were saying, Thom. You know what? People are still coming to this place to get their information. And this thing that's worth something. It's worth millions and millions of dollars. So let's invest in it and pump a bunch of money into the website and see if we can.
I think there are a couple things. It's a brand in what's considered to be still a 2 newspaper town, although actually we have 4. We had 5, but it's now 4. And there are these suburban 40 other titles that I think is actually part of what brings value to this particular brand. And we'll see what they do with it, because there have been attempts before, and quite frankly, their website's been terrible. And there's very little archiving, so if you want to use it for that contextual stuff,
it's
what
impossible
were you
to-
talking about
yeah.
6 months ago? It's not there anymore.
It's not there. It's gone.
So there's a big upside if they really do invest in the web operation and bring these other properties together. I think there is a big question about where the content's going to come from, because there's so much less, even with those 40 other titles around the region, some of which have 2 people running 5 titles. And the Daily Southtown, or whatever it's called now, I'm sorry, that's not the right name, is itself, much smaller than it used to be, both editorially and whatnot. So I would agree with what we were starting earlier, that I think that we're in a transition point that's been going more slowly than I thought it would. I don't want to suggest it's static. I'm encouraged. I do think there's a couple of things I'd speculate about and be curious about the rest of you. Given who bought the Sun-Times, I wonder what's going to happen to the News Co-op, because there's some
Quite a bit,
shared
yeah.
board
Well, and
membership
also
there.
Time Out Chicago.
Yes.
So
there could be a different sort of media empire perhaps being built up here to compete with the Tribune brand, which is still
I want to
gonna be
ask
big.
you about this new media empire, and I also want to ask about the Berlusconification of Chicago media, because according to Greg Hines, and again, that was a really kind of a seminal little piece that Greg Hines just threw together the other day, went back and looked at the contributions, the political contributions and campaigns, and found that pretty much everybody who is one of the new owners of the Sun, or investors and board members of the Sun-Times, pretty much every single one of them is a contributor to Rahm Emanuel, or has some personal tie to Rahm
Significant
Emanuel
contributors.
in very significant ways. At least one of them was the guy who got Rahm Emanuel his little job as an investment banker, where he made all that money in the 2 years that he wasn't in politics. So these are the folks who now own one of the 2, whatever you want to call them, most significant news portals in Chicago. So the question on the table is, when somebody like a Fran Spielman writes something on the front page that's rather critical of the way the city's being handling something, he's got somebody to call now.
Yes, he does.
He's got a lot of people to call.
Yes.
And what does that mean?
I think it remains to be seen what it will mean. We're still all getting used to this new mayor, and they have a message a day. They're very, very organized. They're very controlled in their messaging. So if there's going to be a story that's off message, and this one is, although I think it's of their own creation because of how they've tackled adding user fees to express our First Amendment rights to the nomenclature or the way we operate today. But I who knows what kind of conversations are going on behind the scenes, and let's hope, we can always hope, that the new owners or publishers will keep that firewall in place.
The firewall,
from what journalists, columnists, and others can do in the
One
day-to-day paper.
always hopes for that, but
Yeah, and I think you always hope for that. I mean, as a reporter, obviously you'd be very concerned about something like that. It's not only if that firewall exists, but it's perception. Perception creates reality. We all know that.
right.
And so I think that'll definitely be something to watch, but that's something we need to pay attention to. Even if that firewall is there, what's the perception of that influence on the publication?
what do you think about that? Are you concerned about that ownership influence stuff? Does that bother you, or do you think that it kind of has a way to sort it out with?
Oh, I'm actually not, too worried of it right now.
I thought that's kind of I could see from the expression on your face. Yeah.
The reporters that the Sun-Times has doing, City Hall and investigative reporting are all, very established, and they don't seem like the types who would, back down from a fight. Actually, quite the opposite. So I think it's very, it's very difficult to, to say that the money men, made, they also want the newspaper to succeed, and if if the newspaper isn't breaking stories and writing things that are controversial, then people are going to stop picking it up.
That would be the death knell of what's left of the newspaper if they couldn't do that.
What I would look for is a return to covering public housing, public health, the environment, We only have one education reporter, and she gets to do test score stories. I mean, beyond City Hall reporting, the Sun-Times, quite frankly, has very little enterprise reporting going on. All those people that used to cover those beats aren't there anymore.
They're gone. Yeah.
So that, to me, would be bringing that paper back, whether it's paper or online, to really being a vigorous second paper in town.
And it would require an infusion of some money. I mean, you do have to put some money back into it. Now, these guys have money, so maybe, and it's a fascinating conversation because, you know, I find myself, obviously none of us knows what these conversations have been, but Jim Tyree got a really big pass when he bought the Sun-Times because everybody just kind of, and I guess it was true, but everybody just accepted this notion that he was doing this in a kind of a magnanimous way. He loved having a second newspaper. He had some extra cash, so he threw some cash on the table to save the newspaper. These guys are not coming in with that same PR. There's a difference. There's a difference in the smell test here. That it looks more like a bunch of rich investors coming in to try to see if they can make some money on the Sun-Times. But there's nothing wrong with that if, in the process of doing it, they up the ante and bring in journalists and, exactly as Whet is saying, recognize that the way to make money on this thing right now, you could make money with this if you turned it into a real newspaper.
Tyree's investors actually doubled their money while shrinking the paper.
Yeah.
So that's why I think the jury's out about what this new set of
That's right.
investors are actually going to end up doing.
So
with
you
this.
have a paper today that's almost completely filled with wire copy and not stuff that's being written by people who live in Chicago. So if they can fix that and they have the money to do it, then we could be having a very different conversation a year or two from now.
And one thing I'd add to the sort of the value of the Sun-Times, this is actually a really good point that that Steve Rhodes made, was that they have, you know, the single most valuable journalist in Chicago, in Roger Ebert. I think he said the other day that something like 20% of his readers come from outside the country, much less outside of Chicago.
Yeah. Probably drives all the web traffic too.
I'm assuming it's an enormous portion.
Yeah.
You know, he's the single most famous journalist in Chicago. He's got a long history here, but he's also really embraced the web in a way that you know, is as good as anyone in Chicago has done.
Yeah. Thom, you touched a moment ago on the user fees for the privilege of speaking in the public way, and we can't let the rest of this show go without commenting about that. Kimbriell, your shop has written a piece on how this is going to affect certain communities in Chicago. I think we're all very concerned about what this really means. It's like, oh, you know, we're just going to have this in place for a while during the G8, and then he goes away for a couple of weeks, gets some rest, and comes back and says, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Yeah, that's going to be permanent. And what it is a lot of things. It's doubling of fines. It's defining certain kinds of demonstrations as parades. And because they're parades, that means that you have to register all your sound and recording equipment a week in advance with the city of Chicago.
And permit fees to go with that.
Huge permit fees. So the city is in the position of basically leasing the public square to people if they want to protest, as long as it essentially potentially agrees with what they want to protest. I mean, it's an absurd situation, and it just seems to be getting by without almost any attention. Nobody seems to be terribly concerned about this, and I kind of wonder. I gather folks like you around every once in a while because I know we're the kind of people who are concerned about this, but I think maybe a lot of people are just saying, yeah, this is a good thing. Let's get these dirty people off the streets.
Yeah, but when you have, I mean, we did write about it on our website, chicagoreporter.com, for our blog. And you know, a lot of the cuts that are taking place across the entire country obviously are impacting people who are low, you know, a lot of people who are low income. I mean, obviously it impacts everyone, but low income people are really being hurt by a lot of this. In Chicago, that's synonymous with people who are typically minorities. And so essentially what you have is, if you're limiting how people can, you know, talk about these issues, the duration, how long they could talk about it, you're adding on all these fees, you're kind of criminalizing protesting a little bit. How can people afford this? You're talking about people who are low income earners, and essentially you're squashing their voice. And, you know, what is that perception I talked about earlier? What's the message that's coming out from this? Is like, sit down, shut up, and
Pay your fees.
Pay your fees. But also, I mean, a bigger issue is like when there is change coming from perhaps the city or whatever form of government that we're going to make this change, and that's pretty much the end of that. You're going to have very limited chances to make some sort of change around that. At least publicly.
Yeah, I wanted to read Matt Farmer, who's another friend of our show here, wrote a letter to his Alderman Silverstein, saying, "I urge you to think long and hard before signing off on the mayor's latest attempt to stifle dissent in this city, while of course seeking to boost revenue by increasing penalties for such a dissent. Mayors and aldermen, even in this town, come and go. History teaches, however, that basic civil rights, once curtailed by government, are rarely restored by that government without a fight from the people."
Well put.
Yeah.
And from my vantage point, though I wasn't particularly surprised, because I'm sure the mayor's trying to avoid another 68 headline, by accepting the president's offer to host these summits, there are going to be protests, and why not throw out the welcome mat? Why not look at this as a Chicago Convention and Tourism Bureau opportunity to welcome with open arms all these additional tourists coming to Chicago for the G8 NATO Summit, and have the speaking areas, have the hotel discounts and everything else you would do to encourage those people to come. I'm being a little bit over the top here, but not
Well,
not
that's
that much.
at odds with what the police union
If
says.
indeed we value our democracy, then the First Amendment rights that we fought for 200 some years ago and continue to fight for now continues to be the magnet for the rest of the world. Ought to be something that we celebrate in front of world leaders when they come here.
Oh, and
in
by the
midst of
way,
an
world,
economic
this is the
crisis.
hometown of that Barack Obama guy, too.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. And Haymarket and 68 and the biggest immigration march ever.
And the
in
40-hour work
06,
week.
and a few other things. So, if you want to look at the legacy from Jane Addams through Ida B. Wells and Florence Scala and Gail Sankata, just to mention a few women who have used First Amendment rights effectively to get policy done. This is something that, quite frankly, a transparent mayor who's trying to turn over a new page, I think should be embracing rather than trying to snuff out.
Just think Jane Addams would have to go out and hire somebody just to fill out all the paperwork if she
Absolutely.
were alive today, right?
Think about Dr. King. I mean, we're celebrating on Monday, and now, how much would that movement have cost?
Right,
Would
right.
have happened at all?
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to drop it there. I'm afraid we've burned up another half hour of your time here on CAN TV, but a fascinating conversation, and it's not going to go away. We'll be talking about this a lot more, and we will be asking all these guys to come back because they are very knowledgeable people. So thanks for watching. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You already knew that, but you know that you can find this and all the other programs here on cable, but you can see them on cantv.blip.tv any old time at all. Check them out. It's really an interesting thing to do. You can also subscribe to our program on iTunes, and I hope you will do that. I'm Ken Davis. We'll be back next week with J.C. Brizard, one-on-one interview right here on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.